So today we're going to take the next step after creating a very basic framework and app from last week. So last week, just to summarize what we did is we made our first project and app, and then we filled that app with one page, and that page displayed on our screen and kind of verified that we had Django working. So today we're going, so the next step is really making that most valuable prototype, or minimum viable prototype, MVP, which there were a lot of steps in that in this lecture. And so I actually split it into two parts. And so the first part is going to be creating the structure. And we're going to create two new models. And then we have to create all the functionality to be able to display those models and render them. And then I took out the markdown functionality, and that's going to be Thursday's lecture. And so today is the structure and the function of two pieces of data. And then Thursday we'll be rendering markdown data through those two new structures. And so that's a really nice and easy way to split it. Today we're going to talk about Django and how it works with a lot of detail. This is your first time working with many of these concepts. Even with the stuff that we did last week with the apps and stuff, you really only have to do that once at the beginning of your project. Here, these files and the meaning of each file and how they work together, you're going to keep coming back to over and over and adding these things. So it's really important to start by having a really good picture of how they all work. And so I'm going to do my best to explain it this time, but please remember that it's going to take a while for you to understand exactly what the function of each file in your project is and how it works together. It took me a long time. So don't stress if you don't understand it right away. But anyways, models are an important part of what we're going to be adding, and we're going to be adding two new models. So yeah, just to kind of go through here, this is the home page project folder. I'm going to close this down and open up the one that we made. So there's two subfolders in here. There's blog and homepage. So when we created our project homepage, it created a subfolder also called homepage, and that's where things like settings, the project level URL mappings. But then we created an app. It got put in that same level. And this is app level stuff. And like we talked about last time, if you have one website and you have all these different groupings of functionality, for example, an address book, a calendar, a gallery, file storage, you might have each of these as a separate app. And for us, really the functionality is the blog. And so we made the blog app, and it populated most of this automatically. And then we went in and we added base generic index.html. We added some URL mappings here just to create an index page and a view of that index page. We didn't do much. So just like previous lectures, this content right here tracks exactly what we're doing in the lecture. So you can follow along, and I will share that link here with you so that you can just follow along and do your own cutting and pasting. And that's in the chat window. Okay, so, but I've kind of broken it into these slides. So we're going to do that from here. So you want to go to models. So we can see it's an empty file. Models is where models.py is a Python file that stores Django classes. And these model classes are how we define the structure of the data that we're storing in a database. However, we are not working with any database functions directly. We are defining everything as classes and subclasses of Django model classes. And so there is a lot of functionality built into Django model classes that we don't have to, that we don't know to start off with, but B, that we can use and leverage so we minimize the amount of code that we have to add to our subclasses. And just a brief overview of what is a class. Python is an object-oriented programming language, and so when you create classes, you can it inherits this parent-child relationship from the thing that you're inheriting some functionality from. And when you create child classes, like your own subclass of something, you don't have to write everything over. You can use the functionality that came with the parent class. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to copy and paste this text into models and just replace everything in here. And I'm going to walk through what it is that we're adding and where you can learn a little bit more about that. So the first thing we're doing is we're importing a couple libraries up here. First thing we're doing, most importantly, is we're importing from the Django.db sub package the models module. And so the models module is going to have inside of it the model class. And that Django model class is what we're inheriting when we create our own models going forward. The models module also has a lot of other stuff inside of it. So I encourage you to take a look at what's inside, and we'll use some of that, and then I'll talk about what we're using from it as we go. Then we're also importing a couple other functions, and we'll talk about them as we go. Most importantly, this line right here, line 3 from Django.conf configuration, import settings. So as you recall, we started modifying the homepage.settings.py with some of our own stuff. We can access all that stuff using this import line. So then we can start and say settings.something, and we can access that information from here. So that's a really important line because it allows us to store global settings in one place and access them somewhere else. And we'll be using that a lot. The other thing that we're doing right now is we're also importing the defined user model, because we don't define how users are the user model. It comes predefined by Django with all of the functionality of a user. And users are able to sign on and sign off. They're able to administer the back end of this website. And I believe last time we created one super user, and that was your own username. And right now, the only person who can write posts or who can edit anything is going to be that one user. But we can also reference other models from our own custom models. And so in our definitions, we're going to need that user model. And then finally, there's this line 2 from Django.urls import reverse. If you recall, we have a urls.py located in 2 spots. And this maps how someone goes from a URL, like they type in their browser and they say, I want to go to my blog / some text string. These urls.py allow you to define how to map from someone entering a URL to the functionality inside Django. And so in models, we want to be able to access these names. So we've created one named path, and we've named it index. And so reverse is going to allow us to access that path just by its name. And so it's called reverse because instead of accessing it by a URL, we're accessing it by the name that we created. We will get to that. Do you guys have any questions so far? This is one of the most important files that you'll deal with, because if you think about it properly and set it up right the first time, then the function of your website will flow from the decisions that you made about the model structure and the database structure. You guys have any questions so far?
No, sir.
Okay. So let's just go through our tag. Our tag is a really simple model. It's got one piece of data inside of it and the name. So the name of the tag is the thing that's stored in the tag. Why do we need to go to the trouble of making a full database entry? Well, because we're going to want to use database functions later to be able to query all posts that have a tag, for example. And so by defining tags as a database-based model, we'll be able to use the functionality of the database later. If we wanted to just use Python functionality, then we wouldn't need to go to the trouble of creating this model. But in our case, we want to later add some functionality. And so we're going to the trouble of making a model called tag. The other thing we've defined here, so let's talk about it a little bit. Name comes with a type, and we're creating that type as we define it. So name is the name of the tag, but it also has a data type associated with it, which is different than other things in Python. You could just call it something here, but we know that Django is trying to create some backend database and define the structure of a typed database. So we have to give that database some information. And so there's a bunch of different model types that we can look at, and we can search for it here by just going to Django model types. I think model field reference. And so let's look at some of what those are. Okay, so field types. We have auto field, big auto field, big integer field, binary field. A lot of these aren't very useful. The first one I think that's useful is Boolean field. You can just have a piece of data that's a yes, no. I'm going to use a lot of char fields or character fields. This is basically a field that's a certain number of characters. It's kind of like a string, but there are different kinds of string fields. But you'll see that the tag is a models.char field. We have to define the maximum length of our tag. So you want to think about what's the longest tag I might ever define, and then double it, or add some buffer to that. The other thing that I've added here when I've defined a tag is I've also added a parameter called unique equals true. What that means is that by saying, if I want the name to be unique, that means I can't create two tags with the same name. And that's a nice, that design of which things are unique and which things you could have duplicates of is a really important step here. So basically for our tag, so let's, just going back to this side over here, there are a bunch of fields, date fields, time fields, text fields. A char field and a text field are slightly different. There's URLs, there's email addresses, email field, for example. So you can pick the right field for your application, and it's going to come with all of the logic and knowledge of what you should be doing with that kind of data. And so it's really useful to kind of familiarize yourself with the kind of fields that you have available to you. Files, let's see, file paths, floats. These are all images. There's a lot of different ones here, and we'll talk about them as we make them and need them. But most importantly are, char fields, text fields, and we'll talk about some special ones that link data together as well. And we're about to get to that. The only other thing with the tag model that you want to note here is you need to define the way it represents itself in a string. And so Python classes often come with this underscore str function. This defines how this custom class looks when you print it or when you try and represent it as a string. And so what we're doing here is we're actually going to say we want to return the string value of my name. And so this return line 11, basically defines I'm going to just send out my name when anybody wants to represent this class. Otherwise, it just wouldn't look as pretty and the data wouldn't be available. It would be some sort of tag class with all this, ID information, but it wouldn't just say, what's the tag name? The next class that we are defining is a post. And so you think about all the things that are going to go inside a post on a blog. You want something like the title of the post, maybe the summary of the post. You might want to add the author who wrote it, the time they created it, maybe the time they modified it. And then in addition, because we just created it, maybe all the tags that apply to that post. And so that's what we've done here. I'm going to just simplify my view here. I only have 1, 2, 3, 4 things so far that matter: the title, the author, the tags, and the content. So the title is going to be, I want that to be unique and I want it to be short. And so I can use, again, a char field to define the title of each post. That means that I can't create 2 posts with the exact same title. The next one here is called a foreign key. and it's connected to the name author. So only people who are users of my site can create posts, and I have already got a defined user type that I imported up here. So now I want to link to that user type. And so the way you link to other types that have already been defined, other models that have already been defined, there are a couple different custom fields that you can use. One of them is a foreign key. One of them is a many-to-many. And then there's a one-to-one. And this really determines what the link is between these two models. So the naming convention is really confusing. So if you think about a file folder structure, for example, there's one parent folder and there can be many children to that parent folder. So that represents that when you have a parent-child relationship where you have one thing that can have many relationships, many links to other things, that's a foreign key. And so, for example, the way we think about it is a post has one author, but an author could have written many posts. So in that way, we are just like a file folder structure. We are defining an author in our post who could have written many different posts. And so we're using the foreign key as the link up to that author. There are some things that you have to add. You have to define to make sure that when you delete these links, these one or more of these models, how your system behaves. So the first thing is it possible for you to have no author? And in this case, I say, yes, it's possible. I'll allow that. And then the second thing is when I delete that parent, when the author gets deleted, like let's say I have multiple users on the account, and when I delete the author accidentally or on purpose, what happens to all the posts? So for example, like in a file folder structure, when you delete the parent folder, everything inside of it gets deleted. And you have to make that decision. When I delete the parent, what happens to the children? So in this case, I'm saying, well, you can allow there to be no author. And when the parent gets deleted, you can set the author to nothing. And so that's what I'm doing here. There are other options provided by the models module, but the most important other two would be protect, which means when you delete a parent, try to delete a parent, say you can't because it has children. And the other option would be cascade, which means when you delete the parent, delete all of the children. And so you have a couple different options there on how you treat parent-child relationships. That's really important to just start to understand. The second or the third field here is tags, right? And so we have another kind of relationship here that's defined. The tag can be applied to many different posts. Similarly, a post can have many different tags. So instead of a parent-child relationship, we're going to use the many-to-many field here. And so we're saying tags are many-to-many fields of type tag, and we're going to allow no tags to also be input. And so we're going to permit blank equals true. By saying blank equals true, we're saying we're allowing you to define posts that have no tags. And then finally, content. That's the actual material that's going in the post. And so instead of a char field, char fields are typically used for small numbers of characters. A text field is infinite numbers of characters. You can just put a whole file's worth of information in there. And so that's a text field. And the only two options I want to add here to that one are that, yes, it could be blank, and yes, it could be null. And those are two slightly different meanings, and it took me a long time to figure out what the difference is. But to summarize it, blank equals true means that when I have a user interface, it can be empty. Null equals true means that the database can store nothing, can say it is composed of nothing. So one is on the user side and one is on the storage side. So you do need to define the behavior of both. So I just went through a lot, and I'm assuming a lot about your knowledge and understanding of databases and data types and Python. So I'm going to pause here. Roger, do you have any questions about that?
No. I mean, I wish I was up to speed, but all I can do is listen now, and I'm still trying to figure out old stuff, but my side is all jacked up, so I
Okay.
need to spend time.
Okay. Well, we can pause and solve some of that stuff too. Um, Vishal, did you have any questions about uh, kind of these field types and relationships? And just I see your chat. You say not from your side. Okay. Um, so let's just go down and talk a little bit more about some of these remaining functions here, and then let's start using them. So Django also allows you to define things automatically. And one of the things that it allows you to do using this concept of the pre-made model type that you're just making a subclass of is if you want, you can define extra attributes about your model here in the meta class. So if you create inside your post class a class meta, you can supply other kinds of information. One of the most important things is how would you like this type of model to be sorted by default? And so what you do is you just say, you put a single attribute in there called ordering, and you can either put a single quotes like this to order by one thing, or if you put in multiple things in a row, it'll sort by, title and then author. And so in my case, I want to just sort everything by the title of the post to start with. And we'll change that as we add more pieces of information to our posts. The second thing here is the string function again. Again, we want to define how this post is like displays when we just print it out. And so we want to return not the content, not the author, not the tags, but just the title of the post. That's enough for us to understand what the post is for now. But you could always add to that functionality by saying, the title by somebody or something like that. In this case, I return the title. Finally, there's this function. This is called get absolute URL. This is a function that you don't have to have, but if you include it, it provides some additional functionality in Django. All it's going to do is it's basically going to say, if you have a post, an instance of a post class, and you want to know its URL, you just call the get absolute URL function, and it will return the URL of this Python instance of a class. And so it's a really useful function because sometimes you have the URL of something and you want to get the post. Sometimes you have the post and you want to get the URL when working in Django projects. So in this case, we're returning the URL to the object in Python, to the Python object, and we're using this reverse function that I talked about. So this functionality does not yet exist, and we're going to have to add that. But we're going to need to define what the post path is and how to get to it. So we have to save that for a moment. Okay. So we've gone through models.py, one of the most important files in your Django project. Hi, and you've reached the end of the Lecture 4 preview. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about Django and how to make a blog out of it, then please go to backpack.danakis.com to learn a little bit more. You can register at that site and get all the lecture notes for this course available. You can also go to the course website and find the link in the lecture notes to the GitHub repository that includes the code. So thank you so much for joining me for today, and please stay tuned for Lecture 5, where we will continue finishing the minimum viable prototype of our Django blog. Thanks again.